D3? Wild honey? What's the difference? Let's talk about it. This week we're talking drivers. We've got the D3 and the wild honey. The honeys that we're going to be talking about. We've got a prototype honey right here in the steady plastic. I have a newer run in steady plastic. This is an opaque steady plastic. And then I have a newer run in their transparent steady plastic. Now all three of these fly slightly differently, but that's what we're going to use to compare them to the D3s. So if you're familiar with Prodigy, you know that some of their drivers have gone through several changes over the last 10 years since Prodigy's been a company. First iteration of the D3 is going to be these two. These represent the first approval of the D3 back in 2013 from Prodigy Discs. This is the oldest D3 mold. The second iteration of the D3 is going to be represented by this green disc. Now this one's beat in and it's really flippy, as you'll see when we start to look at some video of these discs flying. But this represents sort of that middle era of Prodigy drivers. And most recently I have a 500 D3. This is from the most recent retool of the D3 back to its overstable origins. So when I compare two discs, the first thing I like to do is to go to the PDGA disc approvals. You can go look at any disc that's out there on the market that's been approved for tournament play by the PDGA, and you can see the measurements that were taken for those discs when they were originally approved by the PDGA. And there's some things you can learn from those approvals. So as you can see, when comparing the three Prodigy molds that have been approved by the PDGA, not much has changed over the years. That change in height can just be explained by maybe the run with a little more dome on it. The rim depth remained unchanged. The rim thickness changed slightly, but back to its original rim thickness, which are the only really changes that you can see. The other stat of note is the rim configuration. You can see slight change in the current D3, and that's just to the wing being slightly more blunt. For this comparison, we're going to be looking at the most recent tooling of the D3 compared to the Wild Honey. And as you can see, they are very similar discs. Looking at the statistics, that rim configuration that you see with the Wild Honey is a slightly sharper rim configuration. The lower a number is for that rim configuration, the sharper that wing is. So that's really the only large difference that you see when you compare these stats. Maybe a slightly more shallow disc with the Wild Honey, but similar rim profile when we start to look at that. So the next comparison I like to make when I am comparing two discs is the parting line height. And the parting line height is the distance between the bottom edge of the wing and the outside edge of the lower rim. So if you were to set this disc on a table, the distance that wing is from the top of the table when it's just resting flat on the table, that would be considered the disc's parting line height. Now, the value of the parting line height is not measured by the PDGA because they don't rate discs based on a stability. That's a big part of a disc's stability, but it is a very useful measurement when you compare two discs. So first, let's take a look at the Wild Honeys. On the left, we have the opaque steady honey. And of all of the Wild Honeys that I have, this one has the lowest parting line. The parting line is slightly lower than the transparent steady honey. It doesn't look like much, but that will make a difference in stability. And so we would expect the blue Wild Honey to be the most understable. Next, I have the orange prototype honey. As you can see, the parting line height is a little higher and it has a little more area underneath that wing for the wind to catch. We're expecting it to be slightly more overstable. So comparing the Wild Honey to the D3, they're very, very similar parting line heights. This green D3 again is from the first retool, or the second sort of era of D3, and this Wild Honey is the opaque steady. This is a more recent run. They have very similar parting line heights, so I would expect them to fly very similarly. Again, moving on the left, I have the transparent steady honey, and I'm comparing that to the original OG, as some people like to call it, D3. And both of these yellow D3s I have similar parting line heights. They're just, one's flatter, one has a little bit more dome. But as you can see, very similar to that steady honey. You can see that the transparent steady honey, when compared to my most flippy D3, has a higher parting line, so we would expect it to be a little more stable than that green D3. And then when compared to the most recent era of D3, it has a slightly sharper wing edge to it, a similar parting line height, but a slightly different profile on that wing. So that'll be interesting to see when we compare flight. So looking at flight, this is my buddy Austin throwing. He typically throws a little over 400 feet on drives, but as you can see, his flat release is not giving these discs a ton of chance to get a full flight. So if you're somebody who throws over 400 feet and you have a really flat release, these discs may be too understable for you. Now coming back the other way, we've got a little bit of a headwind, so wanted to show you, he thought the blue honey, as you can see there, was pretty useful, a good roller, and even though this disc came out early, it gets a nice full flight. That prototype is definitely more overstable. Now with me throwing these discs, I'm throwing about 350 to 375 right now. These are gonna flip up to flat. The understable to stable ones, we have a little bit of a tailwind here now. So you can see as they get progressively more stable, they're flipping up to flat for a little bit less time before they hyzer out. Not getting a full flight into the tailwind just because I can't quite get it up to speed. What is easy to notice in these videos of me throwing is how much more understable the opaque steady honey is than the rest of the honeys, and how much more understable the green D3 is than the other D3s. Coming back the other way, we've got a slight headwind, but as you can see, that little bit of extra headwind is just helping me get a little more turn out of the disc. When I give these height, I can get a nice full flight out of these, but it's pretty clear that the most recent D3 is the most overstable D3, and this honey turns all the way over, never comes out of it. This prototype honey, clearly in the overstable category. With a little help from the headwind, I get a full flight out of it. And these transparent steady honeys, still plenty stable, even with a little bit of headwind. So what's the conclusion? These are both incredible options for straight drivers, those workhorse drivers in your bag. If you're between, I would even say 325 to 350 to that 400 foot range, if you fall into that category, you are gonna absolutely love either one of these discs. So there you have it. The discount code to pick up either one of these discs is gonna be down in the description. Check that out if you're interested in picking either one of these up, and we'll see you next time.